All right. So now I would like to introduce you to Jeannie Martin. She is a fellow and immediate past president of ASLA. Jeannie has been making significant and notable contributions to the practice of landscape architecture for over 25 years, working in both the public and private sector. Her leadership experience and vision for making the world a better place is coupled with an unbridled passion for landscape architecture and the engagement of fellow design professionals. She is very active in leadership, having served at the national level as ASLA Vice President of Government Affairs and Ohio Chapter Trustee, among others. Martin's leadership extends beyond ASLA, volunteering on the Worthington Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Board and the Advisory Board for Kent State's College of Architecture and Environmental Design. In 2009, she was recognized with the Ohio chapter of ASLA with their Service Award, and she was one of the first recipients of ASLA's National Outstanding Service Award in 2013 for her advocacy efforts on behalf of the profession. She is a graduate of The Ohio State University, where she is now working as a senior project manager, doing projects for the university and the Wexner Medical Center. Jeannie, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Krista, and happy National Women in the Design Profession month. It's our month. So I'm very excited to be with everybody on Zoom today. And we have a lot to cover, and as Krista was saying, in a very short amount of time. And for those who do know me well, I tend to talk fast. So I'm going to try to keep it at a good pace and not sound like an auctioneer, but I do have quite a bit to get through. So today we're going to be talking about a landscape architect is a landscape architect, and it's a discussion on women in landscape architecture. The learning objectives that we're going to go over is learning a little bit more about the 1973 ASLA Bulletin on Women in Landscape Architecture, as well as the recommendations of the bulletin. And where are we 50 years later? Because it literally is 50 years later. So here we go. Now, to paraphrase Gertrude Stein, a landscape architect is a landscape architect is a landscape architect. But not if that landscape architect is a woman. In June of 1972, President Freeman, who was the national president of ASLA, asked the Board of Trustees to create a task force to investigate the status of women in landscape architecture. So in November of that year, Darwina Neal accepted President Freeman's invitation to chair the task force. Other members of the task force also included Edith Henderson, Gretchen Beatrice Petit, Sally Shulman, and George Yarwood. Now, she accepted the responsibility partially because she had a vested interest in the results, but it was also with a little bit of trepidation because the growing interest and participation in women's rights movements throughout the country at the time. She feared that there would be, the task force would be equated with women's lib rather than the real charge, which was to discern whether women in the profession feel they are receiving equal pay and responsibility for equal professional competency, education, and experience. So that line, a landscape architect is a landscape architect is a landscape architect, but not if that landscape architect is a woman, was the opening sentence in the report. While the former should be true, a survey of both ASLA and non-ASLA women conducted by the task force revealed a much different case that it's not. So the initial response to the questionnaire sent to ASLA women in December of 1972 was overwhelming in responses, quantity of responses, as well as comments. There was a 50% response rate from ASLA women and 17% response from non-ASLA ones. So several, in fact, who had ended up leaving the profession but still maintained an active interest. And so responses came from women of all ages in a variety of job situations across the country. The interim report to the executive committee in January of '73 was also based on these responses, and it was favorably received, and the task force was encouraged to query more non-ASLA women, which is what's included within this report. Now, Darwina commented on the significance of creating this task force, and ASLA creating it, stating, "Now is the time for the profession of landscape architecture to take the lead among the design professions in the recognition and support of the full extent of abilities and accomplishments of all of its members." So let's get started. Now, are there problems? What are they? And why should it be a concern? So at the time, 50% of the population and 40% of the workforce in the United States is comprised of women. So, and of that, less than 5% of the American Society of Landscape Architects were women. So there were no women landscape architects teaching on a full-time basis, and there was very small percentage of women employed in male-headed offices. So over 2/3 of both groups of women who had responded had experienced discrimination in a variety of ways, from lower salaries, unfair hiring, advancement policies, to the assumption that they should do clerical work in addition to their job as landscape architect, but were not seen suitable for field work or supervision. So the profession at the time was very much a minority one as far as size goes in relationship to other design professions. With the constantly increasing concern for the environment, the scope of landscape architecture profession was expanding and creating an increased demand for qualified landscape architects to do the work. One woman respondent wrote, "The profession needs all the thinking heads it can get, and I suspect many of these are women." So while the society was only 5% women at the time, there had been a gradual increase in the number of women students over the years. So it was recognized that within the next few years, there would be an increase in the number of women who actually were entering the profession, and it was more important than ever that they were able to take an equitable place within it. So how can this be done? Well, first by fostering an awareness of the contributions of women in the profession to date and the recognition of their abilities. From the time Beatrix Horan participated in the founding of the society, women have been active in all aspects of the profession, from women who were pioneers in the areas of the country where there were few people, to those employed in estate planning or who taught in schools of landscape architecture and planned campuses, housing projects, and subdivisions. Yet few landscape architects were aware of the scope and value of this involvement. Also important was women in the profession be recognized for their contributions and abilities, like a sensitivity and willingness for attention to detail and a concern for others. It's a completely different perspective on a project, which when injected in the final project can help make create a better and more adaptable solution. So in the study of potential of women conducted by the Human Engineering Laboratory in Boston, Massachusetts, there's a measurement of differences in ability between men and women in 22 aptitude and knowledge areas. Now, there's no sex difference in 14 of those. Women excel in 6 and men excel in 2. So those abilities which women exceeded included finger dexterity, flow of ideas and verbal fluency, observation, formation of word association, and abstract visualization. Those which men excelled include grip, physical strength, and structural visualization. So now the latter ability involves 3-dimensional thinking and underlies success in technical and scientific professions such as landscape architecture. So while fewer women than men possess this aptitude, there's at least 1 woman and 4 does. So that should be us. So why are there so few women landscape architects? Well, one of the many reasons is that there's a lack of landscape architects in general. And that was mostly due to the lack of knowledge of the public about the profession as a whole. This was combined with the restricted societal views at the time about professions which were not considered suitable or appropriate for women. It is possible many were discouraged before they even tried to get into the profession. Unfortunately, this attitude, landscape architecture is not suitable profession for women, or whether they have certain limitations within it, seems to be carried over from society in general. And some male landscape architects at the time were restricting those women who did enter from practicing the full scope of the profession. Many women in the profession mentioned they entered in spite of initial discouragement, and many switched to landscape architecture because of excessive discrimination in other professions. And there was a feeling that there was less in landscape architecture. So, sorry, I wasn't hitting these. So why is this important to each of them? It's because each landscape architect, is treated as an individual with his or her own special interests. And abilities should be allowed to be given the opportunity to pursue these to their fullest extent, because it's for the benefit of the society as well as that individual. Now, what's the status of women in the profession? So this is the questionnaire that you see on the screen on the right that was sent out to everybody. So in order to gain a clear understanding of the positions women held within the profession at the time, and the extent and types of problems they encountered in their work, the questionnaire was initially sent to all women listed in the ASLA roster at the time. Subsequently, it was then sent to all non-ASLA women the task force could identify. So that included graduates of accredited schools, registrants in the various states, and those whose names were forwarded by ASLA respondents and trustees. So the hope was to be able to concentrate further task force efforts on specific problems women landscape architects faced, and to develop recommendations for definitive action programs, which would create a greater awareness not only of the past and current contributions of women to our profession, but also to the full extent of their capability for further involvement. So a total of 75 responses were received from ASLA women, including there were follow-up long-distance phone calls and notes, and it covered 27 states for 50% return, which is really good. Now, 40 responses were received from non-ASLA women from 32 different states, and that was a 17% return, which is still really good too. So some of the things that they discerned and talked about was employment status and specialization. So the majority of all the women who responded were in private practice, which was about 66 2/3% of ASLA and 40% of non-ASLA. So although nearly 70% of these in both cases were principals in their own firms, all of the non-ASLA principals either had one-woman offices or were co-principals with their husbands, while nearly 1/3 of the ASLA principals employed others. So there was one respondent who headed an office that employed both men and women, but she commented about her difficulty in finding qualified people who were willing to work for a woman. Now, the remainder of those in private practice were either associates, which is about 10%, or employed in landscape architecture planning firms. So 22% ASLA and 12% non-ASLA. 2 non-ASLA women in landscape contracting businesses with their husband, that's what they did, and one was actually employed in that capacity just on her own. So the percentage of those responding who were employed by governmental agencies included which includes federal, state, and county, was approximately the same in both groups, 20% ASLA and 17% non-ASLA. They did find that they had some students responding, and that made up about 70% of the returns. So at the time of the survey, there was only one ASLA woman who was teaching full-time, but she eventually accepted that position or left that position and accepted one within federal government. So that was pretty monumental in the fact that there wasn't anybody that was in education. Specializations was identified by preference, and a few said that they would have gotten more experience in construction if given the opportunity, where others cited limitations due to geographical location. And that lended to them doing an individual practice rather than working in a planning or large office. So one woman left the profession when she found herself relegated to the office and not given the opportunity for field work, which she preferred. So most of those who did specialize had their own offices and concentrated their practice on residences, institutions, and other small-scale projects. So, and here's an interesting fact. The majority of the women who did this were over 45 years of age. And those who had not specialized also said they had done it purposely. Now let's talk about discrimination. So 2/3 of both ASLA and non-ASLA respondents felt that they had experienced discrimination of one sort or another and were of all ages. Of those who said they had experienced none, 1/3 of both groups had their own offices and attributed their lack of encountering discrimination to their lack of professional exposure. Some would not comment at all. So although the proportions of ASLA and non-ASLA respondents who had encountered discrimination were the same, the ways in which they had encountered it varied, which is the graph that you see here on the right. So it encountered and it varied anything from less non-ASLA women expressing specific instances or types of discrimination. And it was readily apparent, however, to a significant number of both groups that had experienced discrimination in regard to salary, although many being unfamiliar with the national salary ranges, and so they were unsure to what degree that they were being discriminated. Now, school. So most women who entered the profession of landscape architecture because it appealed to them for various reasons, either from wanting to be a landscape architect, they knew what, or to an interest in horticulture and the outdoors. Some had a desire to build and create a better place to live, and others wanted to improve the quality of the environment. So many did not realize the scope of the profession until they had gotten into what others did and still went into it in spite of discouragement from guidance counselors and parents who did not feel that women should be landscape architects. So out of the majority of those responding, 67% ASLA and 58% non-ASLA had not experienced discrimination in school. Of those who had, 23% ASLA and 12% non-ASLA said it was mostly from individual professors. So other factors mentioned were curfews, which limited the amount of time women could work in the drafting rooms, which excluded women so they could not receive the same recognition for academic achievement as men did. There was also some resentment from other students, especially when women received higher grades. Some cited less discrimination in landscape architecture than in architecture and engineering, while several had switched into the program because they were either encouraged by landscape architecture professors or felt it was a more valid profession. As we're entering the profession, most women had no trouble entering the profession or getting their first job. Those who did mention offices which would not hire women or only place them in a draftsman job. So significantly, especially in the earlier days of the profession, some women who encountered the problems in getting a job they wanted started their own offices. Now, the main problem was a lack of confidence and knowledge of what the practice of the profession entailed. So this was especially true for those who had been discouraged by professors who told them they would have to work twice as hard to prove themselves. Both women students and recent graduates appreciated the opportunity to talk with women already in the profession to find out what they might expect and to meet successful women landscape architects. Several non-ASLA women who did not lack confidence in entering the profession did lack confidence when in re-entering it after leaving work to raise their families. So almost all, including those who were not practicing, would encourage young women to enter the profession, but only if they had ability and were sincerely interested in it. So in fact, about 40% ASLA and 37% non-ASLA counseled interested young women and young men too, and stated their intent to continue to do so. So those who would not offer encouragement either stated their lack of familiarity with the profession, which is generally non-ASLA, or questioned the current salaries and working conditions. So while encouragement received approval, the comment about recruitment was a whole nother matter, unless it also included men. So 50% of the ASLA respondents felt women should be recruited. 32% they would recruit if men were included as well, and 10% said they would not recruit at all. The general feeling was it was more important to inform everyone about landscape architecture with an emphasis on parents and guidance counselors so young people would be aware of the opportunities as a profession. So now here's an interesting thing. There was a specific need for recruitment, which was most mentioned, and that was for women in education. Because remember I mentioned earlier that there was no women teaching. So they wanted to recruit women in education to provide role models for females and males. This is in the report. It was not me stating a plug for Ohio State University, but the report does identify the Ohio State University as having a committee at the time to recruit women into their landscape architectural program. I do have to say kudos for that. Now let's talk about ASLA participation. So of the ASLA members who responded, 60% have been active in the society. The degree of activity of these respondents varied from 44% who attended chapter meetings or held chapter offices, and 31% participated in national committees, while 50% participated in chapter committees. At least 6 had been chapter presidents. Now, the most commonly held office was secretary or secretary treasurer. So nearly 25% of the non-ASLA respondents had at one time been society members, and half expressed interest in joining again. Now, the reasons they cited for not continuing membership were the cost did not justify the rewards. Husband was a member, and so double membership was not felt to be necessary. And then the last one is they left a full-time job and membership was too expensive when working part-time or not at all. So in the response to the query for reasons why they had never joined ASLA, 25% were working part-time or not at all, and felt the cost of membership was too high. 12% felt no need for membership and questioned its benefits. 10% were in other professions. Now, 10% were also interested, but associated with nurseries or contracting firms. So the main reasons cited for inactivity were lack of chapter meetings, few other landscape architects nearby, distant chapter meetings, and dual obligations to work and family. 3 specific comments, which were also alluded to, which are hard to hear sometimes, is that ASLA is too cool. Its committees work as exclusive groups. That ASLA seems to serve the corporate principal members and not the majority. And women should stop being chapter secretaries unless they feel it would be leading to a higher office. Now, other reasons also varied from the opinion that ASLA was too exclusive to one woman respondent who, as a woman, was not allowed to join initially and then refused to join later when she was asked. So, as we said, there was a lot of challenges. But they also gave suggestions in ways that the society could increase its membership, which included increasing awareness of the profession, foster a strong involvement at the student level with an emphasis on benefits and services provided by the ASLA, and create a nominal category for those not working or working in another field. Also in this, there were some further surveys that could be done, such as a national salary survey, which is salaries of men versus women for comparable years and types of experience in education. This survey was mentioned most often by both ASLA and non-ASLA respondents, and many felt they were being discriminated against, but were not familiar with the salaries others were getting for comparable work. So this questionnaire was included in the back of the bulletin. That was in the 1973 bulletin. They also talked about a survey of men in the profession to discern their attitudes towards women as coworkers and employees. And so this was second in priority and was also included in the questionnaire in the back of the bulletin. They also suggested a survey of women not now in ASLA. So that was a suggestion that was made both by the task force and the executive committee. So it ended up being implemented, included in the report, which we had gone through. And also, they talked about having a compilation of career histories and outstanding projects of women to increase the awareness of their contributions to the profession. So some of the programs that they talked about was an overall education program to acquaint all people with the profession of landscape architecture. So an overwhelming majority of both ASLA and non-ASLA women suggested that these action programs and felt it should be the highest priority for the profession and be implemented by the society as a whole. There's also a career guidance brochure, which depicts the varied lifestyles of those within the profession. And it would serve to acquaint guidance counselors as well as young people with the varied opportunities of a career in landscape architecture. This was the second priority that was given to this activity as a means of pushing the profession and by increasing awareness rather than by recruitment. They also talked about career counseling for students while they are still in college to acquaint them with an actual practice of the profession and a directory of women who are willing to counsel both high school and college students to instill confidence in women that can succeed within the profession. So it was suggested that this program be implemented throughout the profession and probably was most easily through the chapters with an involvement with the various schools. They also talked about increasing the number of women in education to serve as role models for both males and females, encourage more women to join ASLA and participate fully in all of the professional activities, and to sponsor women's seminars to promote an exchange of experience within the profession, as well as the effects of marital status and children on professional life and vice versa. So some who had responded had apparently achieved a successful balance between employment and family responsibilities, but they were still very much interested in knowing how others managed to cope, as well as those who were either contemplating or just attempting this combination. Encourage equal employment opportunities and establish a channel through which inequities can be reported and investigated and information can be disseminated. And then also to increase the awareness of capabilities of women landscape architects to dispel attitude cliches about their employment. There was also continuing education programs in public speaking, construction techniques, and field supervisions, as well as a refresher courses for those who wish to begin working again or keep in touch with the profession while they are not working. So many ASLA women stated the need for continuing education programs as a means for gaining experience that wasn't available to them in their office, while some non-ASLA women looked at it as a means of gaining both the knowledge and the confidence in their abilities, which they needed to re-enter the profession after family obligations had lessened. And there was also a request for an alternative activities program rather than a ladies program at the annual meeting to encourage husbands of women landscape architects to attend. And also to talk about investigation of flexible work schedules to enable women to more easily combine jobs and families. Now, out of the recommendations, there was the ASLA sponsor a seminar on women in the profession. So both the wealth of information which has already been received and the responses elicited by the bulletin had to be analyzed in the context of society as a whole, as well as in relation to landscape architecture and the other design professions. So they thought a seminar brainstorming session between selected landscape architects, architects and planners of both sexes who represented the cutting edge of their professions and professionals who study the comprehensive problems of women in society is imperative. And not only could this seminar formulate valid and implementable courses of action, but it could also foster an increased awareness by both men and women of the potential of women in all the design professions, as well as in landscape architecture, and promote cooperation between them. They also recommended that ASLA sponsor the compilation of a comprehensive history of women in the profession of landscape architecture. Now, the history of landscape architecture encompasses not only the works of landscape architecture constructed through history, but also the history and progress of the development of the profession itself and those who contributed to it. So although women have contributed significantly to the profession since its inception, few landscape architects are aware of these contributions, let alone their extent. So it was time to make them known. And the inclusion of a comparison of the histories of women landscape architects with those of women architects, engineers, and planners would also be of great value. And the ASLA endeavor to increase the number of women in landscape architectural education by identifying those who are qualified to teach and by working through the Council on Education to place them in available positions. So there were no women landscape architects teaching on a full-time basis in any department of landscape architecture at the time of the report. Aside from the fact that HEW now requires each school to employ women in compliance with their individual affirmative action programs, it's crucial that women were employed to provide a broader representation and perspective of the profession within the schools. Additionally, they recommended that ASLA actively encourage women in the profession to not only become members of the society, but to also participate fully in the breadth of its professional offices and activities. So it seems that, this is a quote, "It seems to me that the ignoring of women in landscape architecture and in the society has not been intentional. It simply has not occurred to anyone that it is an important enough situation to worry about. Through the years, however, it has become evident ASLA is a one-sided organization. From the standpoint of simple common sense, the society can help itself far beyond its highest dreams by realistically tapping this source of know-how, the women landscape architect, and shove her into any number of jobs that she can handle superbly. And I do not mean by being a secretary." ASLA, they also recommended that ASLA explore the possibility of developing a continuing education program to facilitate the re-entry of women into the profession. So the FINE report recommended that the establishment of regionally oriented refresher courses to fill the gaps between educational programs through which current practitioners pass and tools and techniques and technologies which have since been developed for use. So such courses would be great value to women who have been practicing, but would not fulfill the needs of those who have not practiced for an extended period of time. So the obligation to stay current with developing technology is even more incumbent on those who are not practicing, since they must preserve the investment that they have already put into their education. And for this reason, societal membership should be considered as an invaluable aid in maintaining this contact within the profession. So after determining whether enough response and participation can be engendered, and to justify it, the society might consider establishing a continuing education program for those who have not been practicing to include such services as regular updated reading lists of pertinent technical information and developments, regional seminars for exchange of information and interaction with practitioners and educators, and exchange or sketch problems with top practitioners as crits to be able to enable keeping their hand in design. So other associated topics that were within the report covered such things such as the history of women in landscape architecture. So of the 8 persons who originally founded ASLA in 1899, Beatrix Jones Friend was the only woman. And in the early 1900s, it was not easy for women to earn a living sufficient to support and educate a family. Since clients in that period were, for the most part, very wealthy, and women often had the right connections in the society of that day, women landscape architects found that they could make a living. So in the early days of the profession, few schools offered formal training other than a few courses until Harvard set up a school in the 1900s with Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. as its first professor. In 1871, the University of Illinois offered 2 terms of instruction in landscape gardening, and Iowa State also had a course in landscape gardening. Since they were land-grant colleges, women were probably accepted. That was the assumption. In contrast, schools such as Harvard and Cornell did not admit women. It was not until 1942 when Elizabeth Barnes Bird was the first woman to graduate from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and Landscape Architecture and broke this institution's non-coeducational stance. So with these restrictions, it was inevitable that there were established exclusively for women, that there were schools that were established this way. So MIT had a Department of Landscape Architecture in the 1990s, or 1890s, not 1990s, 1890s, which graduated a number of very successful women. When Harvard decided to open a school of landscape architecture in 1900, the 2 institutions got together and decided there was not room for 2 schools of landscape architecture in the Boston area. So MIT gave up their school. This meant that the curtailment of landscape architecture education for women, except for 2 or 3 of the land-grant colleges in the Midwest. So there was a school of landscape architecture that was started in Groton, Massachusetts, and it was landscape architecture, gardening, and horticulture for women. For the first 3 years, the Lothrop School course was really one of landscape gardening, but by 1917, it became a school of landscape architecture as the profession was constituted at that time. It received accreditation by ASLA in the mid-1930s and was one of 13 accredited schools. So eventually, the school moved to Providence in 1945 and became affiliated with Rhode Island School of Design. In 1959, Mrs. Ferran left the society, ASLA, $5,000 to be used as its discretion. While it was suggested a scholarship for women students of landscape architecture be established in her name, the money was used instead to furnish the new Washington headquarters with a memorial table hung on the wall of the reception room. She ended up also setting up 3 scholarships at Berkeley. So another project or another topic that was covered within the report was women in WALAP, which stands for Women in Architecture, Landscape Architecture, and Planning. So in the autumn of 1971, a group of women in the fields of design and planning met in order to discuss professions, private lives, and the relationships between the 2. There were about 20 women at the first meeting, and it ended up going late into the evening. So at the end of the evening, there was so much that they wanted to continue to discuss that they all agreed that they would continue to meet weekly to bi-weekly as long as everyone was still interested. From these early meetings, an organization gradually formed into the organization known as WALAP for Women in Landscape Architecture, or in Architecture, Landscape Architecture, and Planning. They compiled a list of names of women in those professions in the Boston area and invited them to come together for discussions and workshops. In March of 1972, a large meeting was held at the Boston Architectural Center, and it was attended by 130 women. One of their first projects and goals was to support and improve women's status in the local schools at MIT and Harvard's GSD. They also addressed the problem of work schedules in regards to restrictions by the Board of Registration on part-time work and the standard work schedule. So the result was the case for flexible work schedules. Now, WALAP continued to hold general meetings until 1975 when it was disbanded. Now, also was discussed in the report was women in education. So it was found during the collection of data for the task force that the number of women entering both undergraduate and graduate landscape architect schools have increased tremendously during the past 2 years during the time of the report, and it was expected to continue to increase. So in contrast, the number of women landscape architects teaching full-time in universities has decreased rather than increased, so that there weren't any. And no one has identified, much less analyzed, the problems which may be associated with these trends. So it was recommended as a profession to pursue these trends and attempt to identify as well as solve any related problems. Now, those were all of the topics that were discussed within the report. That was 1973. We are now in 2023. It's 50 years later. So where are we 50 years later? I don't know about you, but everything that I read, heard, and all of that seems like we're still having the same conversation. We're still talking about tools to tackle gender inequity in the workplace. We're still talking about gender inequity in landscape architecture. How do we make this better? How do we elevate women in a male-dominated industry in 2021? So it doesn't seem like we've really gone that far. Now, what I would tell you is the significance of the early study was a benchmark that can be seen in award-winning work on gender equality recently published by the VELA Project. So the VELA Project is called the name is Visualizing Equity in Landscape Architecture, and it's a woman-led research collaborative led by TJ Marston and Samantha Solano. Now, the purpose of the VELA Project is to instigate collaboration, conversation, and most importantly, action. And they believe that through presenting evidence of experienced collective knowns about equity, that they can formulate agendas that will enact change. So this is an active, live program. You can go to their website and see all the different things that are happening. But I would say it seems like 50 years later, we're still in the same place, or at least it seems like it, maybe a little bit better improvement. So that is all I had to cover. I did talk quickly, but I thank you, and whatever questions we may have, fire away.
Thank you, Jeannie. That was incredible. Thank you for sharing that documented history and just showing how far we've come so far. I thought one of the interesting things that you brought up is based on the amount of the exposure the profession has had. I think it was like in the earlier, like in the 50s era, and kind of introducing like how many women-owned firms were out there compared from then to now. And the women were like, oh, if we don't have a firm to go to, we'll just start our own. And I think that's a great testament to just how many incredible women-founded firms that we have today. And so one of the questions that I had for you, because that shows how there was a deficit and we created opportunity and we made the profession more inviting. Do you think that compared to engineering and architecture, does landscape architecture still reign as being more inviting compared to those fields as well?
Well, obviously I would say yes. I feel the reason why I say that yes, it is much more inviting than the other professionals is that we are really good problem solvers and we're generalists. We tend to know a little bit about a lot of different things. So one of the other things that they had was like, okay, who specialized in stuff? And some didn't specialize in anything because they were, you know, maybe still excited about everything, and that had them be just an overall generalist. But I think that allows the flexibility of landscape architects to hold many different positions, from owning their own firm to doing like what I do. I mean, I'm a project manager. I'm a licensed landscape architect, and I will always be a landscape architect. but I'm using those skill sets in a different manner at OSU in the hospital and overseeing projects that are happening either in the hospital or in the colleges that have nothing to do with what we would deem as gardening or landscape architecture. But it's problem solving, and it's leading others to be able to see the bigger picture and know that while we have one answer, there's many different ways to get to that one answer. That's why I think most women will go there, because of those attributes that we talked about earlier. That problem solving and seeing the bigger picture is something that women are very skilled at doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's encouraging. And I hope that that can not only set a precedent for women coming into the profession and feeling welcome, but as we look to some of the other minority groups that are underrepresented, that also provides a lot of opportunity looking to the future. And we can help that through our profession. We have another question in the chat. Has there been any effort to include an understanding of APLD, Association of Professional Landscape Designers, which is a visibly female-dominated professional organization? Why do so many women belong to that organization, and how do they feel about why they did or did not join ASLA?
Well, let me answer that first part, because I don't. Okay, so the first part I'd say, has there been any communications with APLD? And the answer is yes. We have been talking. ASLA and APLD have been having conversations through the years. I know that we have not been on the same page in a couple areas when it comes to licensure, but we're trying to see how we can align ourselves so that we can capitalize on the profession as a whole and be able to support each other. Now, why would more women be aligned with that organization? I don't know that answer. That's a good one that I'll have to follow up, and then we can kind of maybe add into information on that. I used to know I think he's now the immediate past president, Eric Gilby. He's a good friend of mine, so I'll have to ask him that question. Making a note, sorry.
No, it's okay. Let me know when you're ready.
Go for it.
Next question is, do you have any favorite ASLA initiatives to tackle inequities?
What are my favorites? Well, one, the hardest one that we're having right now is we are losing women like mid-career. We have women, there's a high percentage of women right now in the programs in the schools. And they continue out as they're emerging professionals. But what happens is when they start to have children, we start to lose them because there's a challenge. It's a challenge for us to be seen as a breadwinner and also as the parent. And I would like to work with other strong women that I have met through the years to show it can be done, but then also be there to help support them on that reentry, because it was obviously a problem that was being seen back in the 70s of how do you reenter into the profession after you've been gone for a while. Well, I don't want to see them go. I'd rather see them involved and active so that we can re-engage when it is time and they're ready to do that in whatever manner that is. So that's something that I hold very much dear to my heart about. Good question.
All right, I have a personal question for you from one of our emerging professionals. They're curious to know more about the trends of women in the field that you have observed, such as, did you have many women classmates, and are you working with more women in the profession now than you did in the past?
That's a great question. So as you heard, I went to Ohio State University, and I'll say it for everybody, the Ohio State University. I was one of 3 women in my graduating class out of a total of 30. So no, I didn't have any real girlfriends within the program, either in landscape architecture or in planning or in architecture, because we were segregated, we kept in different groups, which is a different world now. But there also just weren't that many women. So now I would say, I don't know if you had heard me speak in San Francisco, but there definitely are more women involved in my life now. And they are ASLA members, and we have a very close group that is referred to as the Ladyhood, and two of them I know are on this Zoom right now. And we celebrate each other daily. We elevate each other daily. And I feel that it helps us, it helps strengthen women. Because if you see now, for the first time in history, we have 3 women presidents right in a row. You have me as the immediate past president, you have Emily as the sitting president, and you have Sue Lynn as president-elect. We also have 2 candidates, one who is a woman as well, Haley Blakeman, and then we also have Kona Gray. They are both equally. I'm not here to promote one or the other, but just saying it's a really great time for women to be in leadership and to help show emerging professionals that you very much can get involved, stay involved, and catapult yourself professionally and personally, that you find a mentor anytime, anywhere, up and down, as far as older and younger. I always talk about mentor.
Jeannie, did you have any women landscape architects that you looked up to when you were going into the profession, or mentors that stood out?
No. When I entered the program, I was already a sophomore at Ohio State. I had in my head I was going to get my degree in mechanical engineering, and then I was going to go get my master's degree in business, and I was going to go work for IBM. That's because my dad worked for IBM. And I was going to become the youngest vice president of IBM, female vice president, and obviously. And then I sat in on my first engineering class, and I said, no way in hell. And so I bounced around and tried to figure out what I wanted to do. And I was in pre-med, pre-vet. At one point I was in agriculture because I like to be outside. And I met landscape architecture students. And they were the ones who said, hey, come check this out. And I got into the program. But I didn't know any landscape architects until that point. And even at Ohio State, the professors that we had, there were only 2 women that were teaching term members, Charlotte Kitchell and Deb George. And so those were the only 2 women that were there at the time. All the rest were men. I did become close with Jack Carpenter, but that's because he reminded me of my dad, and I could go and sit and talk to him all the time. So he was a great mentor. I do wish that I had a good, strong female mentorship, or had more women classmates to be able to lean on. But I didn't at the time. Now I would say that my mentors is my ladyhood, that each of them certainly inspire me and to try and do different things and push me to become a better person and a better landscape architect.
Well, thank you for your bravery and inspiring us all, especially with the time that you dedicated to helping out ASLA this past couple of years. As we wrap up, I want to acknowledge what you were able to accomplish during your term, not only being involved with the strategic plan, but also your involvement with the climate action plan. And I think we're curious as a local chapter, how can we get more involved in learning about that and putting some actions for ourselves into place?
That is a great question, because we also talked about, many of the women who went into this wanted to be able to improve the environment. And that is definitely the climate action plan. So right now, what we are working on and starting to put together education and information on is the climate action field guide. which is really like a step-by-step process of what you can do at the local level to be able to begin to implement this. So I guess maybe I should come back and talk about that, or have Sue Lynn come and talk, or Emily, or Tori. But that is, or even Von Renner. But all of them, we're getting basically out on the road to be able to really push that out there. So I would say, first of all, read the climate action plan. And then we can come talk about how to implement it through the field guide and what folks can do at the local level, even from an individual to a task force that might be put together at the local level to implement it.
That's great. I love that idea. If anybody is interested in coming together to create that task force, just put your name in the chat and we'll add you, and maybe put together a part 2 of this to do some additional outreach.
That'd be
All
awesome.
right. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jeannie. And this was really great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks everyone for joining. Bye.
Thanks for having me. Do I have to stop share?